So the game sounds like a game.
Yeah, something.
No, that's a fan.
Oh,
I'm just looking at books.
Oh, it's a fan doing it.
I think it's a fan
Interesting.
playing games with your mind. We got a pretty good alignment of the planets. Really, this is like the harmonic.
Yeah, really, that's weird.
well, that's the way they've been.
Well, welcome. Good evening. We have a very small group tonight. So what shall we look at? What would you like to?
I haven't coming for the first time. It's part of me, so.
But of course, the constant condition that we typically find ourselves in is thinking what we know what this is. Thinking, typically along the lines of some consensus reality interpretation, where we're human beings and we're inhabiting these bodies, or even more simplistically, we're biochemical byproducts of these bodies, inhabiting this complex environment, and all of this is going on outside of ourselves, and we're more or less subject to its vagaries. But all this interpretation is entirely inaccurate, it's entirely wrong. And the essential spiritual problem is to notice for yourself and discover for yourself the way that this is so. The way that what is actually here is explicitly and not with no concealment, completely beyond and other than these simplistic interpretations would imply. What is here could be described essentially as an infinite field of light. It's not literally light in the simplistic sense, but what light is what light actually is what it is. So thinking of it in terms of light is fairly accessible. Very much like a dream. In a dream, there can seem to be all sorts of conditions and complexities that are present. All sorts of, you're in a body and you're running around and you're in various circumstances and you're interacting with various circumstances and perhaps other beings doing whatever you're doing in the context of the dream. And yet, when you wake up, or if you go lucid in the dream, you realize none of that's actually there. The only thing that's there is dreaming, which is essentially the presence of a radiant field of subtle energy and consciousness. I mean, calling it subtle energy is begging the question, but what it is doesn't have a name, doesn't have a description, so it's essentially unimportant what we call it. But the context of being in a dream, wandering around, being lost in the circumstances, as we most often are perhaps, and realizing that you are dreaming is drastically different. When you know you're dreaming, you realize none of it's actually there. You're not actually in the dream is in you. You are not of an order of being that corresponds to anything that could appear in the dream. You're completely and utterly beyond that. It is present because you are present. And in analogously, exactly the same condition is present right here. So the essential spiritual task is to notice this and discover this, and do and research for yourself very thoroughly that that is the case, and prove it to yourself very thoroughly, which will essentially eradicate the mind's habitual tendency to continue to go back to these old orientations of holding it to be this and that, and holding yourself to be, these various interpretations that we typically have been indoctrinated in. So there's no context for this. It's just this that is here, this presence. This is you. This presence that is here is you. You're the sole inhabitant of it. You are it. It presents as all sorts of apparent conditions and nuances and flavors of experience and experiential qualities. And it's all here because you are here. Your experience would not be here if you weren't here. And there's nothing whatsoever outside of your experience. So this is you right here. Or in my case, this is me. So I can't know that you actually exist. I can't know that you exist at all. I can suppose you may, I can hypothesize, but I can't possibly know that. Just like you can't know that I exist. Likewise, if you meet someone in the dream at night, you can't know that they exist. You may hypothesize some elaborate scenario in which they actually exist in some other world, but they're showing up in your dream and there's some actual entity there. But you can't know that. All you can really know is they're an apparition in your dream. And they wouldn't be appearing in your dream unless you were dreaming. And exactly the same condition obtains right here. So this is essentially a complete empowerment of noticing that you are not subject to anything whatsoever. On the contrary, everything is subject to you, or let's say subject to your nature.
So why do we have this? We people seem to have, through the ages, this urge to get to know the unknowable, and our cultures and our society are based upon this search, as far as religion goes.
Well, it's the only thing we're searching for. We had the intuition that there's an essentially unsatisfactory condition. We're essentially faking it, and human knowledge is incomplete and unreliable and very, very dicey. And so, of course, there's a quest for actuality.
But people don't know that it's unreliable until they know it.
Well, people know there's an unsatisfactoriness. People know, I think people have a deep intuition people know the extent to which they don't know anything.
Yeah.
And they they can look around them and notice everyone else wandering around in apparently not much better condition. And you can extrapolate that. And also there's because what you are is utterly beyond this. You have a deep knowing and a deep intuition of that, whether or not you are, consciously accessing it. And so there's a sense, there's a sense of this, and we see this in mythology. All these myths of the golden age and heaven, and all of these, extreme examples of ideal conditions and transcendence and all of that. But the challenge is the incredibly complex and self-reinforcing nature of misinterpretation, and it is not just self-reinforcing within one's mind. It's being heavily handedly reinforced by the consensus reality that that seems to permeate the environment in terms of semantic information and other people's behavior and so on and so forth. Which is one of the reasons why simply doing something as simple as going on a spiritual retreat where everyone's sitting around quietly or wearing loincloths or what have you can be so impactful, even if that's all that happens, because you're extricating yourself from this bombardment of consensus reality reinforcement.
So if the problem is the persona or the interpretation or the way in which consciousness or whatever this is that is aware of, is aware, if it's aware through a perspective or a way of seeing, feeling, and being aware, then is this deep research that you're talking about a way of disengaging the interpretation or the persona or how awareness experiences itself?
Well, I'm not sure I can parse exactly what you said, but basically it's a discovery that the persona and the perspective are generated. They're artificial. They don't have any basis in objectivity. And very much the same way the way a dream persona and a dream perspective is generated. In a dream, you may seem to be in a body, you may seem to be in a spatial situation or what have you. And you may that may seem to be that may feel a priori, it may feel like that's the case, and then you're stuck with that in the course of dealing with the dream or trying solving its problems or trying to find happiness or whatever it is you're trying to do in the dream. But of course, the issue is not solving the dream. The issue is discovering you're dreaming, and then you discover the artificiality and the non-essential nature of all these apparent perspectives and personas and embodiments and so on and so forth.
But when you see how arbitrary they are and that they are not continual, but they seem to perpetuate themselves through a very advanced way of patterning and repetition in a certain way, in a familiar way that seems to prolong a kind of persona or a way of seeing and a kind of mythology or a myth of
Sure.
actually being that.
Sure. So what? I mean, all these seemings seem to occur.
Then being disengaged from that is a way.
It's not a matter of being disengaged. It's a matter of finding the true perspective. It's not a matter of engagement or disengagement. It's not a matter of doing something or not doing something. It's a matter of simply seeing what it actually is. You can be as engaged as you want.
Well, seeing, seeing how it's arbitrary.
It's not arbitrary. Arbitrary is the wrong the wrong way to put it. It's not. It is. These perspectives are dependent upon the actual condition, your actual condition, which completely transcends the perspectives. They're not arbitrary necessarily, but they're dependent upon your condition. Your condition is not dependent upon them. So they're discovered to be, secondary. They're discovered not to be causes, but effects, so to speak.
So it's possible to experience an unconditionality. Is that what?
It's not unconditional.
Yeah.
It is the way it is what it is. Which could be which could say it has the conditions of its own nature. It has the conditions of what it is. But it's relatively unconditional compared to all the heavy-handed conditions that seem to be implicit in all these interpretational frameworks that the mind typically holds as its orientational context for dealing with experience.
So this quality of identity, whatever it is, that gloms onto a perspective, can actually shift to this a way of being without an unconditioned.
Absolutely.
So that becomes, that is the identity. That's the.
Well, it always was the identity. It's like when suppose you're watching a movie. Suppose you're at home in your living room watching a movie on TV, and it's a really exciting movie. You just think it's great. It's really well done, and it's juicy, and it's exciting, and you're completely lost in the movie and just like, this is great. I really love it. And so a portion of you is identifying with the conditions in the movie. You're not sitting back dispassionately, completely removed. There's an immersion. There's a sense of participation. There's a sense of degree of suspension of disbelief in going into that. But at the same time, that's an arbitrary perspective. You can do that, or you can leave and go into the kitchen and forget the movie's on and do something else. But the movie is juicy and supplies a context for identification because you're supplying the identity, not because the identity inheres in the movie. So, and exactly analogously, this condition here is the same way. Typically, we're all very familiar with the stance of being completely caught up in one's persona and, caught up in the environment and dealing with it as if it was all very important and very actual and so on and so forth. But, experientially, that is an arbitrary perspective. And it's even obviously an arbitrary perspective if one looks. But typically, people don't look. Typically, people assume the waking state and its apparent orientation, its apparent persona, is reality, and everything that deviates from that exists in the context of that, which is just an assumption. Whereas if you assume all of these different perspectives, like say the perspective of deep sleep, the perspective of distraction, the perspective of daydreaming, the perspective of being in a dream, the perspective of being unconscious, what have you, or whatever other perspectives you want to try to designate, they all deviate from each other and from the waking state. And why assume any one of them is predominant? Why not look and discover the case that there is a condition of presence that is the background condition for all of these, experiential contexts. These apparently experiential, consistent panoramas or what have you that seem to present themselves. So, you look at what's the common denominator of all of them? Presence. You could say, I could say my presence. Obviously that leaves a very open-ended notion of what my is. So why not just say presence? And presence equals me. And that presence is not a naked, plain vanilla presence. On the contrary, it's a presence that seems to be imbued with a high degree of creativity and intelligence and curiosity and motivation to seem to either be generating or investing itself in all these various different contexts, which I call radiance. So you have radiant presence as the essential, the common denominator condition within which all these various experiential perspectives occur. When you're dreaming and you go lucid in a dream, but suppose you stay dreaming but you go lucid, what is it that happens? You get the intuition of, I'm not here. It's not like you necessarily know what you are. You don't necessarily remember the waking world or see yourself outside the dream, but you have a feeling, wait a minute, this is in me. This is in whatever I am. And so all of a sudden you have the immediate felt sense that you are not subject to it. It's not objectively actual. You are objectively actual, and it's appearing because of your actuality. And that exact same sense can be felt across the board because, of course, it's true. The trick is to look and see what reinforces the viability of these various perspectives as being autonomous, like, say, the waking state is, like you talk about, patterning and repetition and things like that. But if you look very closely at the nature of patterning, you discover patterning is actually infinite and unpatterned. You discover there is no repetition, even though there's degrees of consistency where different apparitions don't deviate too drastically from the way they appear at other times. Nonetheless, they never actually repeat. You've never actually experienced the same thing twice. Well, that's interesting. But we sort of ignore that and emphasize the sameness and the repetition. Of course, it's very easy. It's a very simple meditation to feel the uniqueness of every moment. At every moment, I have never experienced anything that I'm experiencing right now. And when you feel that, all of a sudden, boredom is an impossibility. You're in a surprising and interesting and unpredictable newness every instant. And it's not far-fetched. It's not, you don't need to, use heavy-handed suggestion or denial or something to try to maintain a condition like that. On the contrary, it's effortless because it's the actual fact. Whereas trying to ignore that fact, trying to create a condition of boredom, demands an effort of creating sameness where it doesn't actually exist.
That which experiences all those seems to have a kind of consistency to it.
Well, it is what it is. But whether that's consistent, I don't know. It has a nature. It's an objective fact, and so it is what it is, and you can call that a consistency. But since you can't pin down what that means specifically, I mean, who knows? This is what it is, and because it is what it is, it appears the way it appears. And it's consistently that. I mean, that sort of formula is always the case.
There's a kind of knowing that happens that is a knowing that will always be that way.
Well, when one discovers that this condition is essentially beyond time and space, then always becomes a slippery notion. Time and space appear because of it. So there's an always, in the context of history and momentariness, it's definitely an always. And its own terms, whether or not it's an always, who knows?
How does space get created because of that?
It's an interpretive context. When you go to sleep, is there space? When you start dreaming, where's that space come from? Before you're dreaming, is there space? And you start dreaming, and all of a sudden there's space, and then the dream's over. Is there space? And then you wake up, and there's this space. Is this space the same space as the dream space? Is it the same space as the deep sleep non-space or whatever space? I mean, spatiality is a sort of a sense of an experiential context, you could say. Just like time is, It's certainly always now, just like it's always this. And time, in the sense of there being a then, of there being a history, of there being a past and a future, is a projection. No one has ever experienced the past, no one's ever experienced the future. So only the present is ever experienced, only the present has reality, has actuality. And yet, so in what sense does an eternal now constitute time? Well, it constitutes time in the sense of an interpretation of the ever-changing apparitions and the supposition that they were in prior conditions that can be remembered and that they're going to be in subsequent conditions that can be anticipated or not, and so on and so forth. But all that exists in imagination, which exists now. So history exists as a projection now. So the sole actuality of nowness is time, and in space you get the same thing. In space, the only actuality of space is here. Because where does experience happen? Here. All space is experienced here. When you see the sun, you see it here. You know, if you get a telescope and look at it, look at the Andromeda galaxy through the telescope, you see it here. And you can say, well, here seems to have an apparent extension and all that, and you can say, yeah, it kind of does. But you get down to trying to pin down exactly what's going on with that, and you can't. It doesn't resolve into a findable or definable condition. All you can say is it seems to be that way. It's within its functioning to seem to generate that kind of presentation. But then you can have deep sleep or relatively abstract, I don't know what, distractions or something that are relatively non-spatial. So it can do that too. It can present like that.
What's your suggestion of dealing with or perceiving, researching that which sees everything?
Don't worry about it.
To focus on that?
No, my suggestion is just forget it. Focus on what you can focus on.
That can never be discovered or seen.
Well, sure, it can be discovered. It's discovered as what's focused on.
Yes.
When I see this, I'm seeing what's seeing it too, because it's not like what's seeing it is not separate from this. This is seen because what's seeing it is here. It may be difficult to pin down. It may be impossible to pin down, but then everything turns out to be impossible to pin down, so there's no surprise there. I mean, you know, you've heard me talk many times about the essential unresolvability of actuality. And this can be found this can be found absolutely anywhere you look. Anywhere you look, you cannot precisely resolve exactly what's presenting itself in exactly the way it's doing so. In any parameter whatsoever. And so this, you know, this supposed, I mean, we imagine, we sort of, the consciousness in the seer is kind of a boogeyman. It's a projection, it's a fantasy. We suppose there's a scene, so we suppose there's a seer, and they're sort of absolutes that are imagined to exist. But there's no such thing. There is seeing. You know, anything that's held to be a seeing is actually seeing. And the evidence for it is nothing other than seeing. And anything that sees, a seer, is actually seeing, and the evidence for it is seeing. Why not suppose seeing is just a complete miraculous whole and doesn't have parts and doesn't have components and doesn't have polarization? Why do you have to have a seer and a seeing? You know, if you look closely, you may discover that they're just projections. They're assumptions. Because, you know, we're used to thinking, well, I'm here, I'm behind my eyes, looking through my eyes, you know, and then this is out here. And so we project this whole polarization and this whole distance and this whole whatever, a structurality of the whole thing. But all of that is a projection. I think it's very easy to see, and I think if you look, you'll discover that the only thing that is actual that can be found is seeing itself, which is essentially a unity. It can't be teased apart into components or parts. Which makes it very simple. You don't need to worry about the seer. You just have seeing, and here's seeing. So, and seeing is explicit, so you can check it out, which makes it useful. It's a lot like, to me, there's an a very profound implication of the old Sufi riddle about Mullah Nasruddin, who lost his keys in the house, but he's outside on the sidewalk looking for his keys under the street lamp because there's no light in the house. And someone asks him, why are you looking out here when you lost him in the house? He said, there's no light in the house. I'm looking where the light is. Which can be taken simplistically to mean what a fool he is. But on the contrary, I think there's a very profound and powerful hidden meaning, which is look where you can look. So you can't look for consciousness. It's it's like looking for the boogeyman or looking for going on a snipe hunt or looking for God. You can't look for the seen, but you can look for seeing. You can look at experiencing. Because experiencing is very explicit. So look. So this is where so seeing is the street light. So look there and see what you find. And it may turn out you don't need all the other things that you may think you're missing because you're not looking over there, you're looking here.
There is a supposed liberation of knowing that the seeing is not necessarily from what is seemingly a body that we seem to be identified with or connected with.
Of course, if you discover that's the case, then you're liberated from bondage to that orientation. It's like being deprogrammed from being a cult member. If you think, oh, so-and-so is God and I have to go prostrate at his feet all my life because that's the only thing worth doing, and then some cult deprogrammer comes and drags you and sits you in a back room and doesn't let you eat or feeds you sugar or whatever they do for a week, and all of a sudden you go, God, I was fucking nuts. I was thinking I had to do this whole thing, and you're liberated from that. You're liberated from holding that orientation and from needing to follow the implications of it. And likewise, the notion that you're in a body is a similar sort of a cult, in the sense of just it's a belief that is held to be objectively true, in the same sense that a program cult member holds the tenets of the cult to be objectively true. It's true that this great leader is God, and I have to go worship his lotus feet, blah, blah, blah. But when you discover that you're wrong, you're liberated from that orientation. And that's the point, is become liberated from all orientations but the actual orientation.
Well, the discovery of that is based on seeing, not just hearing that.
Well, you have to discover it. It's not the idea is
Right.
not particularly useful except as an idea. You can tell a cult member, by the way, this guy's just another jerk and he's just taking your money and using you. But that information is not necessarily going to be powerful until the person sees the truth of it for themselves. So essentially you have to do the math. I mean, that's the importance of yoga or what have you. You have to come to see it.
Why do they feed them sugar?
I don't know. Maybe it disorients them. I don't know anything about that. So it sounded funny.
I had a friend once who was locked in the closet by the Moonies overnight to get her to convert. This is when I was in college. Because she had a difficult relationship with her parents. It's kind of amazing that somebody would go that far to try to take over another person's mind.
Well, a lot of these cults apparently have all sorts of techniques like that are
Yeah.
essentially brainwashing techniques.
Yeah.
But we've all, your consensus reality has its brainwashing techniques too. The baby doesn't know all the things that a civilized, functional adult knows. All those things have been drilled into them, and yet the adults typically hold it. This is true. This is how it is. It's real. It's objectively true, but it's just another cult.
Right, so the baby wants to eat and stuff.
Sure.
Most people will get co-opted pretty easily.
Of course. I mean, brainwashing is doable, and it's a matter of techniques.
Going back to the earlier point about the dreaming state, I understand the point and I agree. Yet lately I've experienced a few times where I became aware that I was dreaming in a nightmarish scenario, yet I could not extract myself from the dream. I was still going through the experiences of the dream.
Right. Well,
sharing it as a further alternative in a sense. Because sometimes when you have lucid dreaming, you're aware everything is okay. I'm here to attest that not always everything is okay in the dream. Sometimes.
Well, the degree to which there's anything that's not okay in the dream is a degree to which there's still a partial belief in the circumstances of the dream. If a monster's chasing you and you completely know you're dreaming, you laugh at it and say, okay, that's great. I hope it bites my head off. I'd love to see that. That'll be fun. But if there's a little fear involved, even if you have a sense that you're dreaming, if there's a residual fear, and by any degree, then that's an indication that part of you is still in that orientational framework. And actually, that's a good point, because we see this often in people, in spiritual, inquirers, where they have a deep insight of, wow, this is really transcendental. This isn't really like that, but they still are sort of half in their lives and they feel half impacted by it and still being jerked around emotionally by it and so on. So, I mean, this is why for liberation, it's important to completely see the context, to completely see the actual condition. But partially seeing it is good, because then you're on your way. You have your foot in the door. You have something. You know where to look. You have something to work on. And for everyone, it's different. Some people have the ability to just see very, very deeply all of a sudden, but for most people, it's more typically a kind of a ongoing, step-by-step sort of a thing. But that depends on one's individual nature and one's talents and so on, one's intelligence and the nature of the way one's mind works and so on.
So can we go back to the actual discovery, the seeing?
Yes, this is that seeing, by the way. Any seeing is actually that seeing. If you don't think so, then that's because you're interpreting it as being something else. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get in the way of your.
Well, the seeing, I mean, there's a seeing where you're liberated from a seeming body.
Sure.
Now, that's a huge, huge change.
Well, it's not a change, it's an apparent change.
All right.
That's actually your condition right now. And so, since it's already your condition, seeing that it's that condition is not an actual change of condition. It's a change of, you could say, interpretive frame of reference.
And so, this interpreting that's going on is what is it? It's like it's thinking that, I mean, what's involved in it?
Imaginative projection, I don't know, it can't be defined precisely because it's not resolvable.
It's probably different for every person.
Well, perhaps, but I think it's an essential mechanism. It's like, how can you watch a movie and enjoy it? What mechanism enables you to watch a movie and enjoy it? How can you do that? It's just this picture and sound on a wall. It's nothing, and yet you have the ability to project into it and simulate as if it was actual. So you simulate, if this was an actual environment and I was actually in it, then you can kind of, to a degree, you can participate in the flavors of what that would be like.
So is it the creating of a character?
Sure.
You're just creating.
Well, you're not creating it. You're reading off of cues that are present in the patternings that are present. I mean, when you watch a movie, you're not creating a character, but five people can watch the same movie and have a very different experience. So because they're individual, what they, the value structure that they project using the cues of the information, the context that the movie seems to be projecting, it will be a different value structure for each person. And just likewise with this. And the same, but every time you dream at night, the same thing happens. Before the dream, you're nowhere. There's no body, there's no nothing. And then the dream starts, and all of a sudden, not necessarily all of a sudden, but at some point, there's a body perhaps in a circumstance where the various conditions seem to be going on, and all of a sudden you're inhabiting it, and all of us to one degree, and all of a sudden it has flavors and implications and, problems or temptations or whatever. I mean, whatever seems to present itself. So this is the same kind of a situation that happens every time you dream. Your consciousness engages with the bare bones of whatever is there and fleshes it out with meaningfulness by giving it by investment, by living it as if it was so. If this was really so and I was really in it, what would it feel like? I mean, that's basic. I mean, that's not obviously technical, but that's a rough description of what happens when consciousness projects itself into an interpretational framework. Just like the way you get involved in a movie, the way you get involved in a dream. And in the same way, you're involved in your waking life, but you don't need to be any more than you can look away from the movie.
Well, I hear that it's the big joke that you think that you are actually doing things and making things happen.
Yeah, sure.
As opposed to just letting it happen.
No, it's more subtle than that. You are doing things, but the you that's doing things is not you, Irma, the persona in the waking world. So you are doing things, but the you that you're identifying with is not doing things. So it depends. When you say you're not doing things, it kind of depends on which you, what degree of you you're talking about. You, the dreamer of the dream, is doing it all, but you, the little character within the dream, may be powerless to it and may be subject to the conditions of the dream. But that you is really the you that's outside the dream that's doing it all. So it's all a matter, again, of where you identify. Or if you're watching a movie, you can't change the movie. You don't have much latitude to what happens, but you can withdraw your attention from the movie, and all of a sudden it's completely changed. You have the power to do that, and then the movie is nothing. It's just empowered. People do this all the time. You can get lost in a book. If you're really intently in a book, where's the waking world? I mean, you can kind of refer back to it, but if you're really lost in the book, the waking world is a bare, sketchy, ghostly convenience that just, provides the bare basis for your current investment of projection. or lost in a movie, and so on and so forth. All these things are analogous. Or lost in meditation. If you've ever done, prolonged, deep, intense meditation, you're essentially, you're very much in some other context. And it's not like the waking context is necessarily entirely negated, although perhaps it can be. Or when you go to sleep. I mean, every time you go to sleep, where's the waking world go? Where's your body go? Where's your persona go? But in practice, the most effective thing is to explore alternative perspectives rather than downplaying them. Rather than saying there's a prime perspective and everything else is subsequent to that, just pick another perspective and go explore it without assuming that it's a second-class citizen or not. Just go be with that and sort of broaden your repertoire rather than just having a knee-jerk orientation. Oh, here I'm in the waking world and I have to do this because I'm awake and I'm in my body and I have my circumstances in my life. Well, yeah, until the first time you get distracted or have a daydream or have a fantasy or a memory, and all of a sudden you're somewhere else. You're in some other context. Or you have a nap, you close your eyes for a minute and just sort of space out. Where are you then? And the assumption that all of those experiences are somehow subsequent to and aspects of this experience, just look at each experience in its own right as being equally valid. And then from that context, you'll be able to intuit the true perspective much better. Rather than the sort of knee-jerk orientation to a waking state. I mean, typically people are waking state fascists. Waking state Nazis, The waking state is it. The waking state liberalis, When I'm asleep, it's my waking self that goes to sleep. And then when I dream, it's my waking self that's asleep that's dreaming. How about it's your dream self that does waking? Or your dream self that does sleeping? I mean, it's arbitrary how you want to parse it. And if you look at it experientially, there's no basis for determining that. There's the basis of the apparently, superior detail and intricacy of the range of information presented in the waking state. But I think that's very arbitrary. I think, on the contrary, if dreams can be just as detailed as this. And I think deep sleep can be just as detailed as this. Although typically we don't remember that because the waking state can't recall the deep sleep state because it's so alien. But the deep sleep state can't recall the waking state either.
At all.
But there's no basis for supposing anything is less or more, or anything superior or inferior. Without exploring for yourself. So sort of suspend your assumptions of what you think is true and just say, okay, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but let me just explore this as if I didn't. Well, let me explore alternatives. Let me see. Suppose, what would it be like if the waking state was not the dominant state, was not the objective reality? What would it be like if deep sleep was the objective reality and the waking state's an aberration from that? And then dreams are an aberration from that. What would that be like? And then you can just simulate that as a what if and experientially explore that orientation.
I don't really know that I can trust my memory about any of my past experiences.
Of course not. mean, the only thing you can trust about memory is that when it's present, it's present.
Yeah.
And even what it is, even that it's memory, you can't trust.
No.
But it is a presence. It's an experiential presence with a qualitative, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's no accurate way of comparing any state to any other state.
Of course not.
Hypothesis about any of it.
Yeah, because you can't remember any other state from within any state. The waking state can't remember the deep sleep state, even if you can remember anything. I mean, the waking state can't even remember the waking state, even though it pretends to. You try and remember exactly what your lunch was like yesterday.
Right.
And you generate this very sketchy, sort of a ghostly stick figure version of it. It's nothing like the actual experience.
No.
And we don't notice that. We say, no, I remember that pastor really well. It's like, really? You know, the only powerful information is present.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's really palpable and obvious. And it's powerful, you know, because that's wonderful. So if this is where the juice is, then what is this? And just feeling, what is this? What is it?
I'm sometimes very conscious of the fact that I'm making up my memories as I go along.
Of course. I mean, everyone is. We're all.
Yeah. Usually I'm not aware of it. Sometimes I am.
Yeah. But I mean, it's easier to see when other people are revisionists.
Yeah.
Because we tend to be, you know, staunch supporters of our own version of things. No, that's not what happened. But as you say, it's exactly so. They're fabrications.
100%.
You know, they may have a basis of some sort, but ultimately, and in all their details, they're fabrications. I mean, basically, but our interpretation of what's happening in the present moment is likewise a fabrication.
Yeah.
You know, we have this infinitely rich information dense panorama that's presenting, and the consciousness selects these tiny little bits and pieces and strings them together into a narration, says, oh, that's what's happening. But you know, the amount of information that's being left out or ignored or taken for granted is just monumental. But we don't notice it because all this richness is always here, so we sort of think it comes along with us, as it actually does. But it's not in terms of what our narration claims it is. And the present richness of the experiential field is completely uninterpretable. You can't sum it up. You can't pin it all down. You can't inclusively take it all and say, yeah, now I've got it all, and this is what it is. You know, it just can't happen. It cannot happen. It's infinitely open-ended. You could say it's infinitely information dense or information rich, if you want. And so there's sort of a coexistence of two modes or two worlds. The world of identification and identity and narration where, oh, I'm Peter Brown and I'm sitting here and I'm giving a spiritual talk and blah, 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 you know, everything I could say something about. And that exists within the context of and coexists with the actual field of presence of the moment, which it contains and consists of all of this stuff precisely the way it is. You know, where in that world is vast and inconceivably rich, and the other world, the world of narration, is little stick figures, you know, little paltry, like children's stories. You know, where do babies come from? Well, mommy and daddy pray real hard, and then the stork brings it. You know, it's like, really? Where did genetics go? Where did physics go? Where did the Big Bang go? I mean, there's a little bit's being left out of that story, don't you think?
It doesn't seem to be any reason to get upset about it.
Well, that's the point. You know, and when you see that, then there doesn't seem to be any reason to get upset about anything. And how nice.
But another day, there might not be any reason to be cheerful about anything.
Well, sure. Cheerful and upset are both, relative conditions.
Yeah. Well, so my belief in the moment is there's no objective reason to get upset about anything. But there's no intrinsic reason, or there's no relevant reason.
Well, there's not much reason to prefer being upset or not being upset to being upset.
Oh, that's it.
Because they're all just these bizarre, ungraspable energy conditions. And in actual fact, you don't have a whole lot of control over it anyway.
Well,
And what's more, when any condition is present, there's also an infinite richness which is other than that, which is also present. We pretend that, I have one mood at a time and one emotion at a time. Yeah, like really? Emotion is this seething sea of, just all of these contradictory vibes and flavors and vectors and stuff. And it's like, again, it's the narration. We pick a certain simple thing, say, oh, I'm happy. It's like, yeah, I'm happy, but, a part of me is furious, and a part of me is curious, and a part of me is dull, and a part of me is annoyed, and a part of, it's like,
yeah.
Get real. I mean, you just sit, when you sort of sit and space out and you don't qualify anything. Let's say you're just sitting alone in your room and you're tired or something and you have your feet up and you're just kind of like staring at the wall and vegging out. I mean, what are you? You don't know what you are. It's just this richness. It's a sort of a fuzziness, but it's not empty. On the contrary, it's a fullness. But it's not anything in particular. It's sort of just this rich rain cloud of qualities. And that's really the kind of condition we're always in, even when we're pretending we're this or that or the other. And that's really the point, is to note, we're really good at noticing the narration. We're really good at noticing what we're calling what's happening. But the point is to give equal time to the context of that, which is just this vague, fuzzy fullness of all sorts of weirdness and contradiction and chaos that is actually always present.
There's no point in trying to survive or anything.
Well, you do or you don't. I mean,
Yeah.
and it doesn't, and you will or you won't, and ultimately, at the end of the day, so what?
Well, there doesn't seem to be any strategy for that either. All these theories about the parts of our brain that, some of the ego is based in fear and all this stuff as a way of contracting to survive, but it doesn't. First of all, none of that stuff really works.
Well, the energy system has its own nature, which comes out. I mean, if all of a sudden there was an explosion, surprisingly, and suddenly there was an explosion in the room, you would do something.
Yeah.
And you don't know exactly what you would do, and you wouldn't do it as a result of sitting and thinking about it, probably.
No.
You'd do it just because it's your nature to do whatever it is you would do. And that's where survival and all these things
So
come from.
plans of accumulating money to live longer is all a bunch of nonsense.
Well, it's fine. I mean, you can do it, but that doesn't mean you will succeed in doing that. And
But it's sort of like there's no real validity to it. It's too mental and complex.
Well, exactly so. And even if you accumulate a lot of money, you get hit by a car, or you get horrible brain cancer tomorrow, or God knows what, and what's all the money you got to do all of a sudden? You know, you know, you don't the patterning of things has its own actuality, and it does what it does and goes where it goes. But the important thing, the powerful thing, is it's not one thing at a time. It's not a linear. This moves to this, moves to this, moves to this. It's this vast ocean of all sorts of currents going every which way, all the time. And that's what we are. We are that, and our circumstances are that. And what happens is that, and never one thing. It's not like one thing or the other happens. It's like there's always a bazillion things happening at once. And they contradict each other. You know, are you healthy? Well, yeah, I'm healthy in some ways and I'm unhealthy in other ways. You know, are you successful? Well, I'm successful in some ways and I'm a failure in other ways. You know, it's like, it's not a simple thing where, you know, this is how it is and that leads to this and that leads to this, which is what the narration tries to turn it into. Like survival. You know, the survival is you know, you're always kind of surviving and you're always kind of not surviving. You're always moving towards your death and you're always not dying. So, I mean, it's sort of it's like Schrodinger's cat. It's not really alive or dead because the box hasn't been opened.
When we die, we may go to a different state anyway. Even if it's deep unconsciousness, it's still a state, right?
Well, and you can't even know what is this a state? I mean, you can't tell what's a state.
Well, this is
It's not definable.
it's a wide, you know, lots of overlapping states that
Sure.
are hard to define.
Sure. And is it ever anything other than that?
Not really.
I mean, is there ever this state and then that state? It's always just endless weirdness that you can't tell what's going on. And then the next moment it's something else, but you can't tell what's going on. Forever, apparently. So it's continually going into other states.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not mutually exclusive. It's not like a this state or a that state or from this state to that state. It's more just this infinite multitasking of all these overlapping dimensions that are just endless weirdness. I mean, the most insidious lie is coherence. There's no coherence. There's no such thing as coherence.
Yeah.
And when you notice that, that opens the doors to a lot.
Yet we continue to search for coherence.
Well, we continue to claim it and use it and assert it and all of this, but it's all a lie. It's a bullshit. And
We know it.
it's at our own detriment, because by asserting coherence, you're cutting yourself off from the richness of multiple incoherences.
But intrinsically, we know that it's bullshit.
Of course. Humans all know they're faking it. Humans all know they're bullshit artists. That's the basis of Weltschmerz and insecurity. It's the horror that everyone else will find out.
Well, also that somebody else has found it.
Yeah, well, sure, but then they can prove that I don't have it.
Yeah.
And then all that.
You know, the language you're using brings something else to mind for me. We're talking about no coherence, and we're also talking. You were also talking about different things being contradictory to each other. But when you really see this, you see that there's no such thing as contradiction, and there's no such thing as lack of coherence at all, as it is.
Sure.
In a sense. I mean, I can't think of any other way to put it, but the apparent incoherence or the apparent contradictions are only in conceptual labeling or interpretation. But when you see that it's all coexistent in a sense, that's just a way of putting it, but then the whole point of coherence or non, or contradiction or not contradiction, is moot point, because there's none of that. That's all labeling and interpretation.
Well, it's a strategy.
To see that.
Yeah, it's a strategy to talk about incoherence because most people and most people's semantic claiming is based on a claim, an assertion of coherence,
Right.
which is shallow. It's bullshit. It's bravado.
Yeah, but it's important to get beyond even that once you see.
But there's infinite complexity, and the complexity is vectors moving in different divergent directions from each other. You could say, or within the context of each other, and that may be, huh?
Apparently, but not really.
Well, really schmilly. I mean, I don't know.
What can it be divergent from itself?
Other vectors.
You're saying interpretations. One interpretation from another.
You can call it
Or
interpretation.
energies, but
You can call it directions. You know, this photon's going that way, and this photon's going that way.
you know, but it would be irrelevant.
Well, it's not irrelevant because that's all there is.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's irrelevant to think of it going that way, another one going that way, because where is that way and this way? It's not this.
Right. I'm not.
Okay.
I'm talking about strategically. With narrative thinking is based upon the assertion of coherence. In other words, the assertion of being able to say what something is. This is this, and that's that, and that is not this, and this is not that, and the way it works is this, and the relationship between them is that. And all of that is predicated on a coherence which is not actually findable.
Right. So what you're saying is to notice that all that this is this and this is not this is arbitrary. It's simply a label.
It's oversimplification of something which is infinitely more complex and multidimensional than that, which could be said to be less coherent or of a different order of coherence. I mean, the language is not important.
Yeah. That's part of the difficulty, is that language creates the illusion of coherence or non-coherence, whatever
Exactly.
you call it. And yet language is the thing that's being used to redirect the attention in a sense.
Absolutely.
And so it's the old, it takes a thorn to take out the thorn, but yeah, you have to throw them both out.
Yeah, which hence the value of contradictory language.
Yes. I totally concur.
If you're not confused, someone's lying to you.
Yeah. I was trying to make sense of it, but the creates confusion.
I mean, the very word confusion is absolutely delightful word. The roots of the elements of the word are con means with, and fusion means to joining with itself.
That's right.
It's like, sure. It's like the ocean. You can say there's the ocean and there's the deep currents and there's the waves and there's the surface and there's the bottom. But all of that's a pretense. All there is the fucking ocean. There's no parts. There's no, and so that's the confusion of all of those supposed elements into the actuality, which is exactly what it is, which relative to the separate elements is a chaos. Even though it's an absolutely coherent actuality, it's a unity, you might say, or whatever. Unity is another can of worms. We won't go there.
It's a fun, playful thing to contemplate. It does spin you around, turns your head in circles, and then your head falls off. It's like, okay,
well, it's more than playful. It's actually useful. It's powerful.
Right. But being playful with it, I think, is helpful.
Well, it's play is of the essence. The most powerful yoga is play. You may quote me.
Huh?
You may quote me. Or not.
My memory's not that good.
The most powerful yoga is play.
That's right, Levi. My favorite kind.
In these talks, I much prefer when they're sort of pointless ramblings rather than a pseudo-coherent. Sometimes I'll sit and do a presentation for 10 minutes and I'll do a whole speech and say, well, see, there's this and it's like this and blah, blah, blah. And I just, that rubs me the wrong way because it goes against the very flavor of what this is itself. It's just a total, open-ended, what the fuck, so to speak.
Some people just listen to chaotic music or take drugs.
Sure, absolutely.
For what the fuck.
Yeah. Well, I'm an expert in both.
Well qualified.
And deliberately playing with incoherent or relatively incoherent experience is a really useful yogic strategy. I mean, basically that's what meditation is. If you forcibly remove yourself from a waking state coherence into sort of some degree of openness of not being oriented to anything in particular, whatever, to the degree to which you can do that, it's a useful exploration.
I've never seen a connection with a snake over his head. Normally the snake symbolizes Kundalini energy and you see it coming up.
Well, Ganesha is this, the offspring of Shiva, so maybe it's a reference to that or something. I really wouldn't know. I don't know if there's some particular myth that brings that up, or maybe it's artistic license.
I have a question from the internet. Peter talks about pixels as a representation of this. Is karma just a bunch of pixels?
Yes, and it's not that it literally is a bunch of pixels, but noticing the way in which that is true is what frees you from karma. Because karma is entrapping only when it seems to be coherent. And when you discover that its coherence is just a result of oversimplifying something that's infinitely complex and hence can't be resolved into a particular coherence, you discover that you're free of it because it's not actually the limited thing you may have thought it was. I mean, a really good analogy is fractals. If you look at a fractal from a certain perspective, it seems to be a shape. Like if you look at the Mandelbrot set from a certain distance, it sort of this heart shape, it looks like a heart shape lying on its side or something. But then you look more closely and go into it, and it presents infinite different alternative shapes, and they're all its shape, but none of them, but you know, very, very few of them look like a heart lying on its side. And then you discover you're free of the heart lying on its side in the context of this infinite barrage of alternative that it also is. The only thing that's entrapping is limitation, and limitation doesn't actually exist. Limitation is made out of an oversimplified interpretive framework.
Couldn't you say definition is entrapping?
Yeah, exactly. Well, definition, that's what I mean. Oversimplified interpretive framework and it employs definition, or you know, this.
Yeah, it's the same.
They're essentially the same thing. You know, and you discover that what is there is unresolvable, so hence cannot be precisely defined. It's not negated. It's not that it's nothing,
No,
but what it is cannot be resolved into a simple essence of being this or that. And we're entrapped by our thises and that's, not by our open-endednesses.
it's a, we are sure there is something. It's just we don't know what it is.
Well, it's not nothing.
It's
Whether
not
or
nothing,
not
there
it's
is something.
well, even whether or not it's just something though, it's
Well,
getting
okay, then
heavy-handed.
sure that
But yeah,
it's not nothing.
yeah,
But
not in any simple sense.
But as soon as you try and
If
define
if
it,
if this is nothing, it's a hell of a nothing.
Very interesting.
No, it's a very peculiar condition because nothing is findable. Literally, absolutely nothing is findable, but nothing is negated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not it's a condition that's absolutely irrational. You can't find anything. You're looking for anything, you don't actually find it. You know, you discover something else, and the something else isn't even that something else. It's something else, and just endless everything endlessly diverges from what it seemed to be, forever.
yeah.
And so it's not, there's nothing you can find, and yet there's this infinite richness, you know, and you can't even find that it is that, and yet it's self-evident that it is that. It's a very strange condition. You know, in terms of the pixels, a good illustration of that is TV shows. You know, you look at a TV show and it seems to be, you know, the show that it seems to be, Seinfeld or whatever, and there seem to be characters interacting with each other, but you look closely, all there are these little dots of color. And so there's no Seinfeld and there's no interaction, it's just dots of color, each changing and none of them moving. And karma is exactly that way. I mean, you know, all the patterning is exactly that way. If you don't look too closely, it seems to be patterns of this and that, but when you look closely, you discover these patterns are made up of much finer elements which do not resolve into actually being what they appear to be on a grosser level of examination.
And even more so, they have no duration.
Well, all that, yeah.
And they're not patterns.
And they're not what?
Patterns.
No, right. No patterns.
But that's it. In the case of karma, it goes even further because even the dots are made of other dots. And then those dots are made of other dots and so on forever. So you can't, so the pattern you initially thought you were starting with, you end up with Well, we find that, I look at my hand, it looks like my hand, doesn't it? But I look closer and I find the cells, and I look closer, I find the molecules, and I look closer, I find the atoms. And where did my hand go?
You forgot the microbes.
Huh?
You forgot
Yes.
the microbes.
No, absolutely. Oh, no, there's a whole lot in there. This is short, it's a simple version. It's a Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, you can get stuck in the microbes.
But the hand is the atoms, and the atoms is the hand. And you go the other way. This is my hand, but you fly out into the moon, and then my hand looks like the dot of the earth, and then where'd the hand go? But that is the hand.
So that interpretation and perspective is a matter of how closely or how far or from what angle or any of that. And all of that is imagination as well. I mean, it's assigned rather than being concrete in any form, because it doesn't have
Yeah.
no duration.
Yeah, well, that it has no duration is one aspect of it, but yeah, absolutely.
It has nothing, no form, no.
Ultimately, it has nothing findable.
No.
There's no final version that it resolves to being. Every layer of observation yields to another layer, which is completely diverges from the previous layer. And they're all true, and none of them are true.
And yet there still seems to be something that, that there's a knowing that seems to.
Well, it is a knowing. It is a knowing, or and again, you can't pin down exactly what that means because you can't find the knowing. But the knowing that it seems to be is an aspect of what it is.
Pam makes an interesting comment. She says, it's truly astounding because any pattern we can discern and then examine closely breaks down to pixels and go further what's between the pixels, in a sense,
And then what's between the pixels? And then what's between the pixels?
Oh, golly. It's a mind blaster.
You people are trippers.
Yeah, very tricky. That's the fun part.
But the nature, the nature of this actuality that is present, this field of subtle energy, is astounding, and it responds to investigation and observation, and one discovers more and more. Even if you can't pin down what it is ultimately, you can discover more and more what it isn't. And in general, we're bound by, and we suffer as a result of what it isn't, not as a result of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So liberation arrives from discovering what it isn't, and what it is takes care of itself. You might say. Mahesh is waking up. It must be quitting time.
He absorbs it, you know, and
No, that's the best way, but much better than thinking about it.
Yeah. I had 10 good things.
Well, anyway,
Wait, March, when in March is the retreat?
the weekend of the 19th and 20th, I believe. It's on my website and it's also on the Open Secret calendar. During a weekend in March.
Where's the retreat?
Here.
Oh, one of those?
Yeah, probably in this very room on
Okay.
Saturday and Sunday day longs.
That's good.
I hope so. Anyway, good night all. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.